On December 10th, 1936, King Edward VIII is holding one final meeting as king within his personal residence of Fort Belvedere in Surrey, England. A member of the House of Windsor, formerly the Prince of Wales, and now King of England, Edward was forced to make a very difficult decision. His home was once a place of peace, and his favorite place to be, a place where he entertained guests and got to know the love of his life. It was a pleasant place, but now it has a shadow that hovers over him. The last few months have been trying for Edward. The accusations, the scandal, the threats, the audacity of some people. The king had finally had enough. Standing before him were his younger brothers, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, Prince Henry, the Duke of Gloucester, and Prince George, the Duke of Kent. Before him was a piece of paper that had a red seal at the top and a series of typed words, beginning with Instrument of Abdication. The king, only 42 years of age, reads the words carefully to make sure it is clear. I, Edward VIII of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, King, Emperor of India, do hereby declare my irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for myself and for my descendants, and my desire that effect should be to this instrument of abdication immediately. With the stroke of a pen, he signed, Edward, R.I., and now Edward was king no more. 2 days later, Edward gave an address via radio to the nation and to the British Empire that would announce his abdication of the throne. He said, "A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor, and now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne, but I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire, which, as Prince of Wales and lately as king, I have for 25 years tried to serve. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." Edward continues his address. "This decision has been made less difficult to me by the sure knowledge that my brother, with his long training in the public affairs of this country and with his fine qualities, will be about to take my place forthwith without interruption or injury to the life and progress of the empire. And he has one matchless blessing, enjoyed by so many of you, and not bestowed on me: a happy home with his wife and children." With Edward VIII stepping down and giving the throne to his brother, George VI, Queen Elizabeth II, George's daughter, was able to rule England for over 70 years, spawning the modern royal family that we know today, that are discussed in tabloids and dramatized in television shows such as The Crown. But who was the woman that caused Edward to make such a decision? Join me as we explore the interesting life and times of a woman born here in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, Wallis Warfield, to show how Pennsylvania had a hand in determining the current monarchy of England. In the summer of 1896, recently married couple Teakle Wallis Warfield and Alice Montague arrived here at Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, to avoid the heat and terrible conditions of their home city of Baltimore, Maryland. Both Teakle and Alice were from prominent families of means and wealth, and were summering here at the resort town of Blue Ridge Summit because of Teakle's health. Teakle had tuberculosis, and it was only getting worse. The hope was that the fresh mountain air up here of the famous mountain resort would help restore his health. Alice, attending to her husband's health, also had a condition. She was pregnant. Staying in Square Cottage at the Monterey Inn, which is just through these woods down over the hill. And it is located, or was located, somewhere east of Monterey Lane and between Monterey Circle and Charmian Road. Alice gave birth to Bessie Wallis Warfield in that cottage on June 19th, 1896. The Square Cottage, made part of the Monterey Inn complex in the 1880s, stood until shortly after the destruction by fire of the main building, which is the Monterey Inn, in 1942. The cottage was later dismantled and no longer exists. While the small baby was beginning her new life in this world, her father's health continued to decline. Upon returning to Baltimore, Teakle succumbed to tuberculosis on November the 15th, 1896, when young Bessie Wallis was only 5 months old. Now widowed and with a 5-month-old child, Alice Warfield moved in with her mother-in-law at 34 East Preston Street, Baltimore, and began to live off of her deceased husband's family fortune. As Bessie Wallis grew, she attended many prestigious preparatory schools in Maryland, all paid for by her father's family, who only sporadically supported her because of her grandmother's distaste for her mother's family. However, Wallis Warfield, who eventually dropped the name Bessie, lived a rambunctious life of luxury as long as the money continued to flow to her from her father's family. This money was governed by her Uncle Saul, who controlled her allowance and who had questionable motives of controlling Wallis, as he had certain immoral feelings for the young girl. After graduation, Wallis began an adventure of a lifetime, as she was able to travel and be involved in many social circles around the world, gaining a reputation in the bohemian lifestyle of the rich and famous of the early 20th century. While World War I raged in Europe, Wallis Warfield was attending luncheons, dinner parties, and talking to many prominent figures of her day. She ended up living in Pensacola, Florida, with her cousin Corinne, who was married to a U.S. Navy captain who was head of the Pensacola Air Base. It was here that young Wallis met her first husband, Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer, who was known as Win. Wallis and Win married in 1916, but the life of a military wife did not quite fit the socialite Wallis Spencer, now going by that name, Wallis Spencer. As her husband bounced from one base to the next, Wallis was forced to live in government housing in unrefined locations, which clashed with her want for a lavish and luxurious lifestyle. They moved from San Diego, and then Boston, and then Washington, D.C. In those years, Wallis's marriage was in turmoil as she grew disgruntled of the military life and being known as a flirtatious person to men other than her husband. She also dealt with a husband who drank heavily and was at times abusive. With a lack of children due to her inability to conceive or possibly a hesitance for a sexual relationship, Wallis's marriage was deeply in trouble. When her husband was called to China, Wallis began to pursue other relationships other than Win. In 1924, Wallis was asked by Win to move to China with him to work on their relationship. In China, Wallis refined her social skills where she relied on distant contacts to gain access to new social circles. She lived in Shanghai and Peking, now called Beijing, but not always with her husband. Nearing 30, Wallis was pursuing divorce from her husband and decided to move back to the United States to find a new one. On the boat back to her home country, she became ill with stomach attacks that periodically affected her during her life. What the source of these issues were is lost to history, but speculations range from abuse to a botched abortion. History will never tell. Due to her divorce from Wynne in 1928, her Uncle Saul removed her from his will, and Wallis was now in jeopardy of having no money to pay for her lifestyle. She became dependent upon her friends in New York and decided to find a job, but that job search was hindered by her own elevated tastes. Most jobs that she had experience for were beneath her. She needed to find another solution, and fast. Wallis met Ernest Simpson in New York through a childhood friend. Wallis and Ernest connected in a time where divorce was taboo, and where both of them were divorced from their former spouses. Ernest was a good-looking, dependable British-American shipbroker who was not overly rich, but he had something that Wallis needed, and that was security. Ernest and Wallis were not passionately in love with each other. However, Ernest was smitten by the flirtatious Wallis, and they both were able to find a comfortable existence in a world where they both faced the stigma as divorcees. The couple married in 1928, and with Ernest's British roots, they moved to London. Once they established their home there, Wallis began to gather friends of different social circles within the city of London to invite over and entertain. It was these London social circles that got Wallis within the social lives of the friends of the royal family, and eventually the eye of the Prince of Wales. David, the Prince of Wales, who will inherit the throne of England from his father using the name Edward VIII, was a person of strange character. Prince Edward, or David to his friends, ate inadequately, exercised ferociously, was very obsessed with his thinness, nearly to the level of anorexia, and had nervous tics that led some modern psychiatrists to believe that he may have been on the autistic spectrum. Though highly intelligent, he appeared to be bored and tired of authority, questioning his purpose that he was born into as the heir apparent to the throne of England. The royal doctor, Lord Dawson of Penn, was convinced that David's moral development had for some reason been arrested in his adolescence. David's private secretary actually resigned over the prince's behavior, in which David lacked morals to the point that he dismissed his own father's health to continue to seduce the wife of a colonial official in Kenya. In 1931, David's mistress was Thelma Furness, the wife of a rich British shipping mogul, and she was also friends to Wallis Simpson. To keep up appearances, Thelma Furness required a married couple to chaperone a weekend at Thelma's home in which the prince was invited. It was at this time that Wallis and Ernest was able to meet the heir apparent, something that Wallis wanted to do ever since she arrived in London. From here, the relationship of Wallis and David grew. In 1932, the prince attended a dinner party at the Simpson home in London, and Wallis and Ernest was invited to spend a weekend at David's home, Fort Belvedere, which turned into many weekends of parties and dinners. At first, Ernest was flattered with it all, as Wallis explained to her aunt. Ernest did not object, but eventually the invitations of the couple to be in the presence of the prince was only answered by Wallis, as Ernest began to back away from the glamour of the whole thing. In the summer of 1934, Wallis and the prince went on a vacation without Ernest. There was still an entourage that attended with them as they cruised the coast of Spain on board of a friend's boat, but that did not stop the prince and Wallis. Over the past 2 years before this trip, the prince began to obsess over Wallis, spending as much time with her as he could, even eating dinner at the Simpsons' house several times a week and calling Wallis upwards of 3 times a day. Wallis, who tried to control the situation, only believed this was a mild interest. But it was this vacation in 1934 where Wallis said, "Perhaps it was during those evenings off the Spanish coast that we crossed the line that marks the indefinable boundary between friendship and love." As Wallis and David became closer, royal staff members expressed their concerns as the prince would follow Wallis around like a dog. David insisted on presenting Wallis before his parents, the king and queen, and began paying Wallis an income, plus giving her lavish gifts, which spread rumors all across the gossip lines of London and around the British Empire. Wallis recalled, "It seemed unbelievable that I, Wallis Warfield of Baltimore, Maryland, could be part of this enchanted world." In 1935, the marriage of Wallis and Ernest began to unravel as Wallis grew closer to the prince and Ernest further distanced himself from the social life of his wife. On January the 20th, 1936, George V died, and David became Edward VIII, the King of England. He mortified the royal staff as he insisted that Wallis would be by his side at his proclamation ceremony. Wallis was still married at the time, but she was seeking a divorce. Despite civil war in Spain, Hitler violating the Treaty of Versailles, and worldwide economic issues, the new King of England spent 5-day weekends with Wallis at Fort Belvedere and shut himself inside with Wallis any chance he could get while he was in England, while trying to figure out the best way that he could make her his queen. One night in February 1936, Ernest and a friend had dinner with King Edward VIII, in which Ernest asked the king if he intended to marry his wife. The king apparently rose from the table and said, "Do you really think I would be crowned without Wallis by my side?" It is this night that Ernest agreed to let go of Wallis, as long as the king agreed to take care of her. There was a lot of issues at the time for the King of England to marry someone like Wallis Warfield Simpson. First, the monarchy of England belonged to the Church of England, and the Church of England disapproved of remarriage of a divorced person as long as their former spouse was still alive. Wallis had 2 former husbands that were still alive and well. Finally, her American style of dress and her brash manner and famous behavior clashed with the conservative members of the royal family that maintained a more traditional lifestyle. Because of the dislike of Wallis among the royal family and the persistence of the king to make Wallis his queen, Wallis became the center of attention across the empire and around the world, which portrayed Wallis as a woman who pursued the king for his wealth and position. Contrary to popular beliefs, however, Wallis did not wish for the title of queen, and even argued with Edward to make her his former mistress to avoid any marriage entanglements. She even suggested that the king marry her, but give her a lower title such as Duchess rather than queen. But the king had no desire for any of that. He wanted a queen or nothing, and Wallis knew exactly what that meant. Wallis's goals in life were to never worry about money, maintain an independent lifestyle, and be sought by powerful people as a friend and an influencer. If that was what she was trying to achieve by having a relationship with the king, it never came to be quite the way she expected. Wallis became the most hated woman in England. She received hate mail, was hounded by newspapers, and was avoided and shunned by the London elite and former friends. She couldn't even leave her own home. Eventually, Wallis fled London to live permanently at Fort Belvedere in Surrey, as her safety came into question. As the year of 1936 was coming to a close, Wallis fled the country to France to outrun the press as Edward pushed forward with abdication. Just a week after Wallis fled to France, King Edward VIII of England signed his abdication document, and his brother, King George VI, became King of England. On June 3rd, 1937, in a small ceremony in France, Wallis and Edward, now labeled the lackluster title of the Duke of Windsor, married each other with no royal attendants and very few friends. Compared to Wallis's previous life, it was pretty depressing. Wallis was clad in a light blue dress, her husband's favorite color, known as Wallis blue to the media, and was given a diamond diadem to wear in absence of a crown. She was also given a new title, the Duchess of Windsor. However, she was not granted the right to be called Your Highness, per the request of the royal family. After their marriage, Wallis and Edward took a trip to Germany, where they met Adolf Hitler, where they later were labeled Nazi sympathizers by the media. During World War II, Edward was appointed the governor of the Bahamas, which most people considered that position a punishment rather than an honor. For the remainder of their lives together, Wallis and Edward bounced between France and the United States until Edward's death in 1972. Wallis lived a long life after the loss of her third and final husband, living off her husband's estate and allowance from Queen Elizabeth II. Wallis passed away on April the 24th, 1986. She was 89 years old. Despite the turmoil her presence caused, her funeral was attended by Queen Elizabeth and the rest of the royal family, including the current King Charles III. Wallis was allowed once again to return to England. She was buried next to her husband, Edward, in the royal burial ground near Windsor Castle as Wallis, the Duchess of Windsor. The lavish and fascinating life of Wallis Warfield captured the imagination of many people throughout the 20th century, and was even discussed in the 21st century in prize-winning TV dramas and documentaries. Though not the most moral, upright human being on this planet, Wallis was influential and remembered, which is exactly what she wanted to achieve, even though it maybe didn't happen the way she wanted it to. Though she lost a lot of that influence with her husband's abdication of the throne of England, she will go down in history as the woman that threw the British monarchy into turmoil. As time went on, however, the royal family decided to embrace her rather than shun her, by allowing her and her husband to eventually return to England permanently, as they were allowed to be buried at Windsor. The same royal family that gained the throne because of the love that Edward had for Wallis that led to his abdication and the giving up of the throne to them. Though her connection with Franklin County, Pennsylvania is small and only taking place a few months at the beginning of her life, the life of this extraordinary woman began here at this place just below me here in Blue Ridge Summit that led to Pennsylvania changing the modern monarchy of Great Britain forever. Thank you for watching. If you wish to see more, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Please see my sources in the description below also. Thank you again. Remember, these stories are ours, and it is our duty to keep these stories alive. See you next time as I explore what in history.